Loses internet connectivity during today's meeting, please reconnect with us by phone. Please keep your phones and devices muted until you are called on. Turn off sound to any other devices around you to minimize interference. To our virtual attendees using Microsoft Teams, please turn off your video feed. I will address you when it's appropriate to turn on in a moment. Microsoft Teams chat should only be used for participants who need technical assistance and for members of the public to request to speak during the public comment period. All public comments must be shared verbally for the record during the assigned public comment periods. Additional notes for JFAC members and commissioners participating virtually wish to be recognized to speak on an item during the course of the meeting. Please turn on your video feed and raise the virtual hand in Teams. Someone says I monitor the video feeds, but I guess Matt, will you monitor the video? Somebody
sure. We'll monitor.
The video feeds will be monitored, and we will turn on as an indicator to speak. Do we have any commissioners joining us by phone today without the video option? Additional notes for members of the public who would like to provide feedback and comment. We will hold public comment periods at the beginning of and end of the meeting. Those requesting to speak may do so only one comment period and be allotted up to how many? We'll say 2 to 3 minutes to speak. We'll definitely hold it to under 3 minutes. To speak on tonight's agenda items. When virtual attendees are called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is located on your meeting command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. Lastly, this is a public forum. Today's meeting will be recorded and posted to the county website. All information associated with today's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Freedom of Information Act requirements. So welcome, everyone. Great to see everyone here. Thank you for coming in person. It is really important. We didn't have a forum in our January meeting, and we couldn't get our business done that we wanted to get done. So it's really great that everyone made it tonight. Thank you. I don't have much of a chair's update other than our March meeting. I think we will formally invite you all to that, but it's going to be a joint meeting with the FAC. And we will be getting a presentation on the
long-term facilities.
The long-term facilities plan, the long-term assessment. Is it the criteria or anyway? It will be virtual and it will be March the 13th. So it's not our normal meeting date. I think it's the FAC's normal meeting date, but that will be in lieu of the JFAC March meeting. We'll have that joint meeting, but I think that will be really interesting to us. So that is,
yeah. I had a question. So you said it will be virtual. I assume it will be recorded and you can see it later, or
yes,
or not necessarily.
So I can check with Michael De Palma. I'm not sure what the protocols are. Has it been updated for the APS side?
okay. But if it's a joint meeting with us, then we will.
Right. Our county policy is that it would be recorded, so we'll work with APS to
Okay,
make
Michael.
that happen.
The other chair's update, because we don't really have a liaison, is that Steve went to a commissioners meeting, a virtual meeting on the Virginia Hospital site, and he's going to give us a brief update on what happened at that meeting.
Sure. So everyone may or may not have followed the announcement that came out on January 24th between the county and VHC Health that VHC Health, a letter of intent has been signed. They plan to acquire half of the Carlin Springs site. They formerly owned, and through a land swap deal with Arlington, Arlington acquired the entire 11.5 This was apparently novel, that it was multiple commissions being invited to come together to hear the briefing. And it sounds like the county and VHC, in part because they hope to have an expedited process for approvals, thought it would be a good idea to bring commissions together and jointly. I did express disappointment. I made the point that I couldn't really speak for JFAC because we hadn't had a meeting and a chance to discuss this. But I did express disappointment that JFAC had not been notified about this or actually involved in the planning process, which, because I've been involved with JFAC from day one, we were led to believe that we would be extensively involved in long-range site planning site. But I also tried to make the point that the community, which I also live in, broadly supports the facility and recognizes the need, pressing need for these kinds of behavioral wellness services. So I think that there's a desire to be constructive and work together collaboratively. But a couple of points I did want to make tonight. One is I haven't seen any clear indication that there's been any real interaction with APS about this. And I think that's something that we might want to ask as JFAC as to what degree APS is being invited into the picture consistent with our charter at JFAC. Even though the letter of intent has been signed, there's still potentially could be some co-location possibilities. And I think recent events, if anything, have further highlighted how important it could be for APS to really have a seat at the table. They are beginning the site planning process, and there will hopefully be a substantive input before the site plan actually goes in. The other thing I do want to mention, it appears to be real that the county is having discussions with Animal Welfare League of Arlington about the north part of the site that the county would retain ownership of. And there, I think, one would hope that they would remember JFAC and that they arguably shouldn't be making a site decision about what happens there without our being meaningfully involved in the process. And I do know the community, these strong rumors that AWLA would like to move their entire operation to that location, as well as open up a wildlife rehabilitation center, which would be a new thing. I think there's a lot of interest in the latter, in part because it could be synergistic with Long Branch Nature Center. But there's a lot of concern about the animal shelter being located there, including, okay, if you're going to have barking dogs 24/7 right next to residences and to patients in a behavioral wellness center, what could go wrong?
Unless it's co-location where they can pet the bark. I don't know, I mean, that's the thing.
There is a therapy animal. Yeah, I mean,
but that's probably not.
I personally am trying to emphasize creative and constructive collaborative discussions. But I think those are sort of two things that I think we might involve. Positive sense. And what's going on with AWLA? There's going to be a 500-car underground parking garage, and that would be jointly owned by the county, VHC Health. And questions are being asked about. That's a lot of cars. So there must be more to the picture than we're being told thus far. So one final note, there will be a community briefing, they're calling it, on February 27th of the proposed facility. And that's going to be open. The county did issue in the Page Arlington update. There's a bullet point. So if anyone is interested in hearing more, that would be tune in. I think it's only scheduled hour, I believe, but that could be it. So, trying to be, that's it.
That's
Unless
great.
there's any questions.
I have maybe a follow-up on building on the AWLA potential. When we split into those two subgroups, one of the discussions we had about what is a facility and what makes the most sense for facilities to be located within the county versus we have plenty of facilities and services that are located outside of the county boundaries. And there hasn't ever really been a methodical analysis of which services are we, contracting out that need to be located within county boundaries. Obviously, for some things, I think, fire stations, right? They need to be in. But obviously, trash, right? We have those where do animal shelters and wildlife rehabilitation sit in that kind of spectrum? And then are there other services that are currently being provided far away that might make sense to have located closer? And I remember the one that I just thought of was I think it was like a parent training, like if maybe like a drug, a parent of a child is involved in drugs and they need to do some training and it's hard for them to get transportation to this mandatory kind of counseling. They're currently having to take Fairfax buses and get all the way out. So as part of, behavioral health support, all of that stuff, it seems like we should try to raise this or be mindful that where things, how close in different services are located should maybe dictate some of what ends up going where. Understand that AWLA is interested, but there's just some geographic factors.
I guess what I think about, and I agree, Claire, with that. So right now, AWLA is on what otherwise looks like footprint for Trade Center. So one could speculate that there's a thought process that if you do relocate out of the current site, that would free up a little bit of space for Trade Center futures. So I can only speculate about what the thought process might be, but
I thought they were not on county property.
I don't know, but it's certainly, it's like an
renting.
indentation into the Trade Center site. So, but I don't know the full backstory on that.
Very close to it. I mean, that again sort of points to this front line.
Yes.
And I think that there are lots of parts of there are the impacts of long-range planning, especially for the Trade Center site, kind of extend far beyond the Trade Center site to buses parked at Quincy site, to what kind of BPS school buses there will be, and kind of that other.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that update, Steve, and thank you for being the liaison.
Happy to do it.
Okay, I guess we have reached public comment. Do we have members of the public that would like to provide comment on our agenda items?
Terry is raising her hand.
Okay, Terry? Can't hear you, Terry.
Muted, Terry.
How about now?
Yes.
Hey, you guys, just so you know, your audio is really not good. So it goes in and then it goes out and in and out. And I think it has to do as you move around and you get farther away from your computer. But sometimes it's inaudible. Okay, just letting you know that. Okay, so yeah, you just touched about something I was talking about today. The Arlington animal welfare. And that's interesting. You just said they were thinking about that they might go there. I think that would be kind of cool. A lot of wildlife there. So I think that actually is a really good idea. The other thing is you're talking about the joint facilities. And for me, I don't understand, like, if we do this missing middle thing, how are we supposed to park more fire trucks, have more fire stations, build out schools, have parking for teachers, hospital facilities, doctors, school buses. I just don't know where this is going, and it doesn't seem very well thought out, if at all. Actually, I don't think there's been any real planning done on those pieces. And so I would hope that when you weigh in with the county board, that you would please note that and bring attention to it, because the solution is not to build schools on parks. I mean, that's not a good solution. And there has to be some other way. And so bringing more and more and more while we have less and less and less land doesn't make much sense to me. But anyway, that's basically what I have to say. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, next is Ann Bodine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Oh, hi, thanks. I'm Ann Bodine. I'm from Lyon Park, and thanks for letting me speak. In 2018, we pledged to add the same number of residents as the populations of Charlottesville and Culpeper, about 63,000. But we did zero planning for new services, and those cities have 20 schools, 29 parks, 4 libraries, and 11 bus lines. So we're already behind the curve. Since then, we've added other density programs, but no added plans for these impacts either. Fast forward to Missy Middle, 6 plexes in all zones. This is a major change and upends the GLUP pledge to preserve and enhance existing single-family areas. It also upends the pledge from former county board member Gutschall that we would not be doing anything like Minneapolis with countywide upzoning. I want to refer you to a lengthy report by Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future prepared in January for the board's RTA vote. A link has been provided to you by Mr. Ladd. Most relevant for JFAC, pages 35 to 40, which discuss the budget implications. ASF noted that JFAC on October 26 mulled whether the county would be ready if missing middle projections exceeded 20 infill projects a year. Several commissioners said at the time that you should be advising the property to build schools, and others pondered when you should begin planning other public facilities. You should have begun planning the same day missing middle was announced in 2019. You know the budget pressures we are facing, and we are all going to see our taxes rise yet again. Finally, I hope you look into other ASF points in that paper, backed up by FOIA information and deep research that take issue with other county claims, including, this isn't a change from low density land use. This is not more harmful than single family zoning. It fills a critical housing shortage, when the real housing shortage is for low income housing near transit. It will be senior friendly. It will reduce development in outlying suburbs. It will be family friendly. It will increase racial or socioeconomic diversity in North Arlington. I leave you with another imponderable. The county's cheapest 3-bedroom missing middle unit is projected to come in at about $1.1 million, 32% higher than the median 3-bedroom sold in Arlington in 2022. It will require a household income of 237% of area median income. I hope you dig a little deeper to go beyond the top line talking points for this plan. It deserves much deeper review and some critical thinking before it is passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann. Next.
We've got BR, I assume is Bill Roos, is that you, Bill?
Yeah, hi. More of a question, which is back last April, JFAC sent the report on the research question number 3, that was the missing middle, as it was being, how it was being implemented in other communities. So my question is, has JFAC received a response from either the county board or the school board to that report?
Is that the end of your comment, Bill?
Yeah. I just was wondering, did you get anything back from the county board or the school board when you sent them that report?
I will answer that, and The answer is no. We did not receive any. I received a very formal reply from the school board office saying that they received it. But I did not get a formal response from the county board. I did, our county board liaison did recognize it, and I had several conversations with her about it, and we are, I don't know if you noticed on tonight's agenda, I hope we can approve a letter tonight that's bringing back up the recommendations we made in that report to the county board before they, that we're hoping to approve it tonight so that we can get it sent to them before the March vote.
Okay, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I assume that was Chair Stacy there?
Yes, that was Stacy Snyder answering. I think when we sent that report, I think in April I was acting as chair because Kathleen was on family leave, and yes, so I would have received the report. I mean, I would have received feedback. Kathleen may have received feedback, but I did not reach out to her. But I can't speak. I was the one that sent it, so I was the one that got the formal school board response. But I don't, and Kathleen may have gotten other responses, but I don't know of them.
Okay, appreciate that. One thing I would say is it's kind of hard to tell with this setup if we're attending virtually as to who's speaking, because we can only see like half the people there. So just a thought. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, that's good to know. I will, maybe we can, recognize ourselves before we speak.
In the future meetings, maybe the tallest person in the room shouldn't be right next. Sorry about that.
Go in ascending order in elementary school. Okay, is there any other public comment?
No, we don't have. No one else is asking to be recognized.
Okay, well, then let's move on to our next agenda item. Thank you, members of the public, for coming and making comment and asking questions. If you want to stay till the end of the meeting, we will, hopefully be voting on that letter to the county board on just reiterating the recommendations we made in that report. Okay. All right. So the next agenda item, we have an update on projections and forecasts. From. You want to introduce yourselves?
Sure.
Who are here?
Robert Ruiz, APS staff. Before I begin, at the March 13th meeting, the consultant will cover the long-range plan to renovate existing facilities. That's the name of the study that they'll be covering. Let me project my. On the Excel, sorry, on the Mac. There. Right. So yes, so good evening again, Robert Ruiz, APS staff. Next slide. Okay, so this evening I'll cover the context for projections. I'll cover the fall 2022 10-year projections themselves, and then lightly touch on a document called the Projections, Budget, and Staffing Timeline. It's a draft infographic. And I'll hand it over to Elizabeth and Emily. And last, we'll cover Q&A, questions and answers. So if you could please hold your questions till the very end, and we'll just go through the presentation. So some background on projections. Projections are only for grades K to 12. Pre-K is not projected. So pre-K reflects an allocation in the prior year's fiscal budget from the Office of Early Childhood. So again, pre-K is not projected. Projections use the current September 30th enrollment as a base or a starting point, and this is by school. It uses the most current enrollment trends from the last 3 years. It's prepared annually in the fall for a 10-year time horizon. The approach was last reviewed and updated in the Community Facility Study. And there's extensive data sharing with my two co-presenters here. So with Arlington County government. So that includes sharing information on the housing unit forecast, which is updated every year, existing housing stock, again, updated every year, and the birth forecast, also updated every year. So let's look at the components for projections. It uses the latest September 30th enrollment for each school, and that's used as a base or starting point for projections. Added to this are actual and forecasted births from the county, and those are used to project incoming kindergarten enrollment 5 years later from those. And then grades 1 to 12 projections rely on school by school and grade by grade student progression trends. And then the county's housing forecast is used to estimate enrollment from future housing. And this is done by every attendance zone, so elementary, middle, and high. So let's look at APS enrollment over time. So as you can see, enrollment trends have fluctuated over time. Recently, APS hit a milestone in that pre-K to 12 enrollment reached an all-time high of 28,020 students in fall 2019. But right after came the COVID pandemic, and we had 2 periods of year-over-year enrollment declines between fall 19 and 2020, and 2020 and 2021. I should mention that this was not unique to Arlington. It was also like a national trend. It was a regional trend. School districts like Fairfax and Montgomery County had this occur as well. But from fall 2021 to fall 2022, we've experienced year-over-year pre-K to 12 enrollment growth of about 2%. So that's a change. But future September 30 enrollment counts will provide answers if this is the makings of a new enrollment trend of stabilization or renewed growth. So there's still a question mark out there. What does this mean? And we need more additional years to conclusively know what trend we're beginning. So this chart looks at year-over-year enrollment growth for K to 12 enrollment since fall 2005. And the way to read it is those gray bars represent year-over-year enrollment growth for K to 12 enrollment, the enrollment that's projected. So this is historical data. And the orange line represents percentage change year-over-year. At least for the K to 12 enrollment, since about fall 2014, year-over-year enrollment growth was still positive, but it was decelerating. So you can see that it was around 5% in that 13 to 14 fall period, and then it was gradually decelerating to around 2% between fall 18 and It's worth mentioning that per the community facility study, which had definitions for types of growth, growth of around 2% or above is still considered high when you compare it nationally and among peers. So even though growth was decelerating, it was still high. And then between fall 19 and 20 and fall 20 and 21, you see the impacts of COVID. And again, between fall 21 and 22, we've seen a rebound of 1.7% for K to 12. This chart can be read the same. The gray bars represent the year-over-year numerical change, and the green lines represent percentage change. But this applies only to K to 5 enrollment. And you can see that the fall in enrollment between fall 19 and 20 was more pronounced at the elementary level than K to 12 overall. But the increase of enrollment between fall 21 and 22 was very similar to the K to 12 trends overall, 1.7, 1.9 for elementary. At the middle school level, it's a different narrative. So between fall 19 and 2020, there was enrollment declines, not as much as K to 12, but between fall 2020 and 21, the enrollments declines were more pronounced than K to 12 overall. And very differently, between fall 21 and 22, enrollment did not have a rebound. It continued going down. So it declined by around 0.8%, plus 1 percentage point. And high school tells a different narrative still.
Yeah.
And even through the beginning of the COVID pandemic, between fall 19 and 2020, growth was still positive. Continued being positive between 20 and 21, and between fall 21 and 22, at 3.4%, that growth, year-over-year growth was higher than K to 12 or elementary. So earlier I mentioned that those actual birth counts and birth forecasts are important to projections because they are used to project the number of incoming kindergarten students 5 years later. One thing to note on this chart is those gray bars, which represent actual historical births that occurred to Arlington County parents. So this would apply to births even if they happen, for example, across the line at Sibley Hospital in DC, they would still be counted as Arlington births. But since about 2016, you can see that for the most part, we've had year-over-year declines in actual births. Of course, that would have implications to projections. And then Elizabeth and Emily every year provide APS with a forecast of births from their COG model. And so the latest forecast of births from last fall is on those orange bars. As you can see, it's interesting that based on their current modeling, those births are below the 2021 levels. They're you could say they're mostly flat to having a declining sort of trend. And of course, that has implications for the projections because actual births from 2018 to 2021 and forecasted births for 22 to 27 impact the incoming kindergarten students for 2023 to 2032. If you're comparing the current projections to the fall 21 projections, one thing to note is that the assumptions on the incoming Ks were different. And that blue line represents the fall 2021 birth forecast that was used for that round of projections. And as you can see, those projections or those forecasts of births are slightly higher than the current ones. So again, that would have implications for the enrollment projections.
So can I just ask a quick question just to confirm? So the birth trends, it's not just Arlington. This is sort of a national or a regional, data backs it up nationally and regionally.
Yeah, I think last year on a similar presentation, I had a chart showing that, the US Census been looking at birth information and, some of the lowest recorded births happened very recently. That might have changed now that we're getting past the pandemic, but I'm not sure.
Talk about that a little.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
So one of the other components to those incoming kindergarten projections, and by the way, the kindergarten projections are the most difficult ones and the ones that have the most level of uncertainty because the students are not in EPS, obviously. But besides looking at actual births, another data point that we look at is something called birth to kindergarten ratios, and those are done by neighborhood elementary attendance zone. So these numbers are APS system-wide, just for illustrative purposes. But when it comes to projections, these are done attendance zone by attendance zone. But system-wide, what you can see is that since about 2015, 2016, since around this period, that birth to kindergarten ratio has hovered around 70%. So what that means is births occur 1 year. Around 70% of that count of births are counted as incoming kindergarten students 5 years later. We keep track of this year after year after year, but that 5-year distance is in time. But with the pandemic from around 21 school year, that's fallen below that 70% threshold. And so at the bottom, pre-pandemic, 3-year average was around 70% for the kindergarten capture rate. Since the pandemic, that's gone down to around 64%. And of course, that has implications to those kindergarten projections and to elementary projections. Another factor that I look at is something called cohort transition rate. So that's looking at students in one grade 1 year and their count, and then how many students progressed into the following grade the following year. This is done by every single school, but these numbers are system-wide, just for presentation purposes. But one of the things that's notable is that since the pandemic, many of these cohort transition rates, so these rates that kind of tell us how many students progress from one grade to another, have been below 1.0. And what 1.0 means is that there was enrollment loss. And so you can see that again, for example, at grades 1 to 2, those rates, went from around 1.0 in the 18 to 19 period to around, let's say, 94% and 98%. So 94% of first graders progressed to second grade. 98% of first graders progressed to second grade the following school year. For 7 of those grade progression periods that we look at, it's turned positive to at least neutral, at least to 1. So that is also impacts projections, but on the positive side, in that it builds momentum for the projections. So that's something that we'll be looking again next September 30th to see how those are shaping up if that trend continues. Another thing that impacts the projections, as noticed earlier, is those housing forecasts, and the way the housing forecast works in the projections is that student generation rates are applied to that housing forecast. That housing forecast is disaggregated by every single attendance zone, elementary, middle, and high. So it's not done system-wide, it's actually very tailored to every single attendance zone and how it in terms of the student yield by unit type and affordability level. One thing I'll notice that from year to year, there's always fluctuations in the student generation rates because our enrollment is changing over time, and those that in that ratio, that's the numerator, and also our housing stock changes, usually grows, and that's our denominator. But beyond those natural changes, there's also some changes to the housing unit count, some improvements to the housing unit counts and quality control that occurred that also made those figures that it played into that variation from year to year. Just noting that if you're comparing student generation rates from fall 21 to 22. And as a plug for the enrollment projections report, the school by school student generation rates are in attachment C of the report. So now I'll cover the fall 22 10-year projections themselves, and another plug for the projections report. If you want to see the full report in terms of what the assumptions and methodology were, as well as some of the attachments, for example, student generation rates, the accuracy statistics by individual schools, those are all included in the projections report. So that's in the, if you go to the apsva.us website, on the upper menu, there's an option called About Us. Click on that one, go to Statistics, and then go to Projections, and you'll find the projections report as well as archive projection reports. So looking at the projections, and looking at it, so the projections are done every year in the projection, 10-year projection period, but let's look at it at 3 points in time, 1 year out, 5 years out, and 10 years out. So the way to read that table is on the left-hand side, this gray column refers to September 30th, 2022, and that's only as a point of reference for looking at some of the comparisons in the table. So it includes the fall 2023 K-12 projections, in this case around 27,000. And it also includes the pre-K, the allocated budgeted pre-K numbers, 1,236. And you'll notice that number is held static. There's no projection again for pre-K. So whatever was budgeted for the last fiscal year is just carried over to give a holistic, a more complete pre-K to 12 figure. So so the table includes fall 2023, 1 year out, fall 2027, 5 years out, and fall 2032, 10 years out. So in that 1 year period between comparing fall 2022 to 23, K-12 enrollment is expected to increase by around 2%. But when pre-K is factored in, that growth grows to around just under 3%. The 5-year period between 22 and 27, in K-12 enrollment is expected to be around 4%, almost flat. But when pre-K is factored in, that growth is around 1.2%. And 10 years out, growth is projected to be negative. So just under negative 3% for K-12. When pre-K is factored, that's just under negative 2%. But when you look at the projections 10 years out, some caution needs to be. Again, we're coming out of the pandemic period, and there's still a lot of unknowns about what enrollment will look like long-term once we are beyond the pandemic. So that the long range projections, which I would categorize as those between like 6 years out and 10 years out, I would use with caution and be mindful of that it's picking up some of those trends. So this chart shows pre-K, it divides enrollment into K to 12 and pre-K. So those gray bars represent historical K to 12 enrollment, and at the bottom is the pre-K historical enrollment. And again, like the high point for enrollment occurred in 2019, just before the pandemic. And then for the projection period, the high point is expected to be 2025, with about 27,120 projected K to 12 students. And then you add the 1,230 budgeted pre-K seats. So that, and after that 2025 period, then enrollment is at least projected for the time being as steadily going down year. Another aspect that's covered in the report and it's worth noting in this presentation is the accuracy figures for the projections. So this, in the enrollment projections report, accuracy information is provided for every single school, elementary, middle, and high. So this is just system-wide. But the thing to note is that, when we, those of us who do the projections, what we strive for is to be at least a percentage point positive or negative from the actuals the next fall, the following fall. With the pandemic, that was more difficult to do, and so the accuracy went from around 100% in that 2017 period to 99% in 18 and fall 2019 to around 93% with the impacts of the pandemic, and then 92% by fall 21. With the fall 22 projections, accuracy is again within that 1% threshold at around 101%.
Is that 392% correct?
Pardon me?
Is
That's for specialty programs.
okay.
Secondary.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one for the secondary, not projected in this year would include the virtual. So when the projections were done the prior year, there was no expectation or knowledge that there would be virtual. So those in the table that's in attachment in the projections report, it's more clearly laid out what goes into the secondary not projected. But for that 1 year, those virtuals were included in that subset.
Okay.
Again, because they were not projected. But good point. And then pre-K is included for reference. And then this chart shows every line represents a different projection round going back to fall 2013. And I think the takeaway from this one is that at least the last 2 projection rounds have really been among the most conservative since that fall 2013 period. The fall 2022 one is a little bit higher than the fall 21, but they follow, but they're very similar regardless, at least in that degree, the more conservative projections. Then this is the infographic that I mentioned, the budget and staffing timeline, projection budget and staffing timeline. And I only include this for this presentation because tomorrow the APS superintendent's proposed budget will be presented. And the one thing, a takeaway is that in the timeline of the way that projections evolve over time, especially the next year projections, the school year 23-24. All projections were released in December, and that includes this upcoming school year's projection. The superintendent will present the superintendent's proposed budget tomorrow, but that will still reference those fall projections for the year upcoming. Those projections will be updated, at least for that school year, with some of the tools to manage enrollment that are included in the enrollment management plan, which will be published in a couple of days. And so that will be known as the spring update to the 2024. And it will be that updated projection that will then factor into the HR meetings that the HR will have with all the principals in terms of hiring and staffing, and it'll also figure into the school board's proposed budget. So just wanted to highlight that point. Turn it over to Elizabeth and Emily.
Robert, we're at second here together. Great. So I'm Elizabeth Hardy. I'm here with my colleague Emily Garrett. We are in the CPHD. We are the research team for the county, so we're all here present tonight with you. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite. We're just going to give you a demographic update. Okay, talk about population estimates, components of change, migration, age, birth projections, the forecast around 10, and some housing unit trends. Let's start with our population estimates. So this slide goes back to 2011, and it shows population for Arlington and how it's increased over time. The green lines, the green bars are the Census Bureau's intercensal estimates that they produce every year. The pink line is the 2020 census. And as you can see, the Census Bureau estimates that we lost population in 2021. And the Census Bureau has not released their 2022 or 23 estimates yet, but we have our own CPHD estimates, and we estimate that we are reaching about 237,000 in 2023, so slowly getting back up to that 2020 census number. So I'm sure you all have heard components of change. That's what really changes the population. You have births, deaths, and migration. Births minus deaths is called the natural increase, and we get that data from the state on an annual basis. And while the number of births in Arlington are about 2.5 times that of deaths, we still have trends that can lower that overall natural increase. So across the U.S., we've seen decades of declining birth rates. Also for deaths, we've had an increase in mortality rates due to the pandemic. We also have an aging population, so that's going to impact the number, unfortunately, of deaths that occur every year. And then migration. Migration is the hardest factor to get a handle on. In terms of when we do our estimates, we use proxy data in terms of household composition, household size, and occupancy or vacancy rates for housing units to be that proxy to understand how people are moving in and out of our community. So migration is reported by the Census Bureau as in terms of domestic and international migration. And the trends that we've been seeing for domestic is that there's been movement increasing to the southern region of the U.S., so that Texas to Florida and up to New Jersey, kind of thinking about that area, North Carolina. I don't know where Jersey came from. So that area is really drawing folks, and there's been many news articles about that. And then for international migration, those trends are really policy driven, so we can see changes in international migration. Those trends when international migration went down prior to the years prior to the pandemic, and then was exacerbated by the pandemic. But we're starting to see that international migration at a nationwide level back up to that 2015 level. So hopefully that will keep up at that rate. Okay, so this is Arlington's migration going back to 2011. The green is domestic migration, so movement within the U.S., and the pink is international migration, and then the blue line looks at the net. So the years after the recession, 2011, 2012, we had both positive international and domestic migration in the county. However, as the rest of the country kind of rebounded from the recession and there were more job and opportunities throughout the country, we started to see negative domestic migration. But always international migration was a positive. So you can see, for the last from 2014 to 2020, the net migration was up and down around the zero mark, except for 2021. And we've had a substantial domestic out-migration due to the pandemic and the economic forces that came about as a result. And where did folks go in Virginia? This is looking at 2020 and 2021 data from the Census Bureau. You can see there's a big green blob right above the Richmond area. Green is positive migration, and then the pink colors is migration. So folks moved to parts of Virginia that were, I think they had more space, more affordable, but still, close enough to a transportation network where they could get to those major job corridors. So that really highlights that area. And focusing in on Northern Virginia and DC and Maryland, focusing in there, you can see that Arlington, Alexandria, and the district, we all lost population. So Arlington was not alone in this. And even out to the larger jurisdictions of Fairfax, Prince George's County, and Montgomery, we all saw decreases in population. Even though Loudoun and Prince William, they saw increases, it wasn't anywhere compared to any that they've had in the past. So let's look at our population estimates by age. What we did, we broke it down to 5 different age groups. So the under 20, 20 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 plus. And this looks at 2010 to 2021. So the 2010 census and then the 2021 population estimates. And Arlington's population overall grew about 12% through that time period. So you'd think, each age group would be something similar, but really there's a couple groups here that stand out, one being those 20 to 34. So all decline by 10%. And another group is those 65 and older, saw an increase by 50%. Another way to look at this is the annual population change by age. So this looks at the percent change going back to 2011. And two of these sections don't look like the others. If we start with the 20 to 34 years, you can see starting in 2013, that population started to decline and continues to decline in the county. And then in the last year, from the 2020 pandemic to 2021 estimate, we saw that every other age group declined except for those 65 and older. And what's also interesting is, that 65 and older had pretty strong increases in every one of those years. Okay, so here we get to the birth trends and projections. So between 2007 and 2020, fertility rates dropped across the U.S. from 2.12 to 1.64, and that's just a 13-year period. I think that's a pretty substantial drop for two main reasons. One, because women are delaying when they have their first child, and then as a result, they're having fewer children overall. And then since the 1990, fertility rates have fallen. If we look at the fertility rates by race and ethnicity, they have fallen for each race and ethnic group. This chart is from University of Virginia, Bowman Cooper Center, and it breaks out the change in births since 2007 for the regions of Virginia. So you have Hampton Roads in blue, Northern Virginia in dark green, Richmond in light green, and the remainder of Virginia in the orangey color. So you can see Northern Virginia is not like the rest of the state. You know, they all are pretty much at. What's interesting about this, the labels on the right, 0 is the second line. So they're all, you know, going down. The birth rates are going down for each region, except less for Northern Virginia between that about 2012 to 20 time frame. But then eventually, overall, you know, it dies off at the end there and kind of picks up the same rate as the rest of the state. This just looks at the overall bursts, number of bursts to Arlington residents going back to 1995. So I know Robert had some of this data in his presentation, but you know, going back to 1995, this is the lowest we've had in this 26 year period. And I thought when I was looking at this, well, I wonder, is it the lowest we've ever had? So we have to, you know, go back and see if we can find that data if it's available to see if we can go back and see when the last time we had births at this rate. 2021, definitely the lowest. So just, you know, without trying to get too confusing about how we do the birth projections, as a result from the community facility study, we have a model that was built by RLS Demographics. That was one of the consultants from that study. And it's a model that's based on census data and population counts. And what it does is it uses rate tables for survival, migration, fertility rates, and it projects the population forward. However, every year we get updates with, you know, how many actual births have occurred. So we go in and we calibrate the model so that it meets those actual births in the output. And then we also calibrate it to our forecast population. So we change the crude migration rate, total fertility rates, based on what we're seeing and what we're seeing with other data, and also to meet those actual numbers that we're getting. And what is produced is births in 5-year increments to meet the forecast increments. And we do a magic formula to create them in a 1 year average to send to Robert, and that's what he was showing you. I'm going to hand it over to Emily to talk about the forecast.
Great. So I will briefly discuss Forecast Ground 10.0. So CPHD participates in the MWCOG regional cooperative forecasting process, with the most recent being conducted in the fall of 2022. So we submitted a new forecast for Arlington, which breaks down housing, households, population, and employment in 5-year increments for a 30-year period from 2020 to 2050. And this is our first regional forecast to go to 2050. We look at the current housing stock as well as county board approved plans, the general land use plan, and zoning to identify areas that will also likely accommodate additional housing units. We apply factors, occupancy factors to obtain households, and an average household size is applied to obtain the household population. So this is the resulting forecast population. As you can see, between 2020 and 2025, the growth is less than the other 5-year increments. This is because of the population decline due to the pandemic. We estimate that the population will reach over 245,000 by 2025 and climb to over 300,000 by 2050. So next we will discuss some residential development trends. We are able to analyze these trends through our development tracking system. This tracking system has been in operation since 2000. It tracks and analyzes commercial and residential development data based on permits and county board actions. We produce 6 reports on a quarterly and annual basis, which highlight activity and trends and project status. So whether the project started construction, was completed, approved by the county board, or demolished. This graphic shows the net new housing for all units. Green shows multifamily and pink shows single family. On average, 96% of net new housing is multifamily, which have a high percent of 1 and 2 bedroom units and smaller average household sizes. This shows the change in single-family housing, including detached and attached homes. On average, 200 single-family units get constructed, but about 160 get demolished. This leaves a net of about 40 units each year. Multifamily sees many more new units constructed than demolished. This is driven much more by economic forces, and the amount of construction is cyclical. On average, there are 1,200 new units and 60 are demolished. This leaves a net of about 1,140 units each year. I will also briefly highlight our annual profile report. This is Arlington's annual statistical fact book that we produce every year. It contains over 100 variables provided by departments from across the county. It contains data related to population, housing, households, employment, development, schools and education, transportation, community services, health services, and the forecast. And we are working on updating it now, and it should be released in the next couple months.
Great. Thanks, Emily. I just wanted to recap. I know it's a lot of information, but just wanted to recap some key takeaways for this evening. The Arlington's population aged 20 to 34 has been declining since 2013. The pandemic impact and natural increase in migration really resulted in Arlington's population decline after the 2020 census, but also keep in mind that we're not alone in that. That happened to many, many jurisdictions throughout the country. Arlington's population 65 plus was the only age cohort that increased from 2020 to 2021. The number of births will likely continue to decline for Arlington, Virginia, and the rest of the nation. And just also keep in mind CPHD, we continually monitor the changes in housing and demographics, and we report them in the reports that Emily mentioned, so feel free to, if you want to get on our mailing list or whatever for email distribution, feel free to email us. We can add your name to that list so you can get information when they're released. But we use those reports and the data in them to update our population estimates and forecasts, so then they are reflecting the most rates. We do updates, throughout the year. We update our population estimates twice a year, so then when we give Robert the data in the fall, he has the latest and greatest data that is available in the county. Robert has it before anyone else. So I think that's it. And we're happy. Very much.
First of all, thank you. This is really fantastic data to help us in our mission. So just gratitude to the three of you for your work on this. One thing I'm really struggling with, everything that was projected except for one slide basically says that the birth rate is going down. Young people are migrating, so they're not having kids here. The number of older folks is going up. And so our school enrollment is going down. But yet, over the next 50 or 60 years, we're seeing populations going up. That one didn't make sense to me. Maybe I just missed something. But I think maybe, Emily, that was your slide. Can you help me understand that a little bit? And maybe it's just that there's a very impacted short-term blip, but that trend line looks incredibly different from the entire rest of the presentation.
Yes, you're right. And I think it's because of what goes into the forecast and where that population is growing. In the forecast, I'm sorry, Emily.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
When we do the forecast, as Emily said, we look at areas that could receive receive more density than what's on the ground now, based on general land use plans, sector plans, anything that's been approved by the county board. And in the areas are, I'm going to pull up the profile because it has that map, right? Mm-hmm. The areas of growth are areas with smaller household sizes. So even though we're having in its 5 decades, I want to say like 7,000 housing units, maybe more, within that each 5-year increment. It's producing people, but it might not be producing kids.
Sure.
You go to Arlington profile. I guess I'm just, yeah, I'm not sharing my screen. I will.
Yeah, well, Elizabeth explained that to her point, multifamily units, if you look at that student generation rates table by attendance zone, so multifamily units, especially market rate, which are the majority, they produce, on average, they have among some of the lowest student generation rates.
Okay, so just to say back to you guys, what you're saying to me is, we don't expect the school population to increase materially. In fact, it's going to decline. But we're building a lot of housing stock to attract many more folks, but there are people who generally don't have as many kids. Is that correct? And anyone else in the committee, please tell me if I'm.
That basically sounds right, yeah.
So that's, one of the last slides showed most of the grosses in multifamily homes or town, that were targeted to that 20 to 34. But I was trying to wrap my head around the fact that that's the largest demographic that's declining.
Yeah.
So who's moving into these condos?
I live in Boston, that's gotta be remote.
Yeah.
Or they're all moving to Boston.
That is still the highest proportion of the county in the, the fact that it's declined by what, 11,000 over the last 12 years. It was really high in 2010. We had a lot of that age group, but
It's the highest.
It's divorced people, right? Well, like,
Apparently.
Also,
I mean,
who don't have
in
custody.
or young
terms of-
people, or
well, under 20, very young for that expensive housing.
You're seeing-
Because 20 to 34 rate is declining.
Right.
So, but it's double 65 years or older. So maybe
Oh, I see.
the households get divorced and someone moves up here or something.
yeah, it could
Well-
be that. It could be roommates. It could be, the 65 and older population is also growing, filling in the area. The under 20 is growing as well, whether that's family households, non-family households. Family households, but how big is that household size? We have more housing units, which means we have more households, and then we have more population. But the rate at which the population is growing is slowing.
Just one more really interesting point. You're also saying that the number of single-family homes in a town of 240,000 people is growing by 40 a year, which is virtually nothing, right? Whereas the number of multifamily is growing by like 1,140, something like that. And then the other impact, sorry, I'll be quiet, this is just super interesting, is all of the growth is going to happen in certain areas. So when we look at we plan for facilities and we think about how does our county change, that we're basically anticipating the vast majority of that change to happen in a very small amount of our land right here.
This is actually
Yeah, so what
previous
is this?
forecast. This is our previous forecast in the current profile document that Emily was talking about. And it shows population growth based on our forecast, and this is shows the concentrations of where that population is forecast. And when we do our forecast, we do it at the parcel level. So we're kind of unique in Arlington. Not every jurisdiction does it this way, but we start at the parcel level, and we have many, many meetings with planners, as Matt can attest to. Hours of meeting going through each parcel to see what's there, what could be there, has a plan been approved, what does the general land use plan say, what does the zoning say? So we do that every couple of years and build our forecast up from that.
So, I'm sorry, it's Elizabeth?
Yes.
Okay, so presumably there's just only two ways the population can grow, right? It's either more housing units or more people in each housing unit or some combination. There's two. So when you look at your forecasted growth, that was 70,000 people or so over 25 years, it looked like. Where is the growth? The growth coming from increase in housing units, or is there a disproportionate factor that's driving growth? Presumably, the housing units is not going up all that much.
Right. So that's a good point. So like the average household size In 2010, 2011, 2012, it was really high. And I think that, we could see that with the impact of schools and the kids in schools. But it's come down since then. So we've actually updated our estimates process to incorporate the most recent American Community Survey data to capture those average household sizes. But in the forecast, it's mostly driven by increase as we keep the average household size constant, but it's constant kept by unit type and by census tract geography.
I mean, what's fascinating to me about that is just that that's something that's controllable. Housing growth through land use planning, through targeting of where growth occurs, through the type of buildings that you're building, what kinds of demographics that attracts. So I just think that's pretty interesting.
So are birth rates controllable? So this is not like, I don't think they're getting into that side of things.
So I'm also looking at the fall 2022 APS projections reports that Robert was speaking to. See the big differences in the student generation rates by housing type. So for a single detached house, the generation rate's 0.471. So if I'm reading that right, roughly 1.5 student per single detached home. Whereas for market rates, multifamily elevator, which is I think most of what's driving that 1,100 figure every year, the generation rate looks to be 0.062. So much smaller. So almost a tenth.
I have just a couple questions. So the Arlington profile report, is that an annual report? We do it annually?
For how many years?
Since 1982. We weren't doing it back then.
It's interesting. My background of involvement is more in APS, so I'm more familiar with APS kind of projections and those reports, but so that is very interesting. And then and just another question I had in terms of like the demographics and the breakdown of ages, does that change like as the population ages, or does that stay pretty static? Like with an elementary school, you see a cohort of students big cohort of students enter elementary school, and then you see that sort of adding to, and then 5 years later they hit middle school, or 6 years later they hit middle school, and then you see that the middle school projections go up. And so if do you see a similar thing with age cohorts, or does it stay relatively static in terms of like the 20 to 34-year-olds kind of come in and then move out, and come in and move out, come in and move out, but they don't kind of stay in age in Arlington?
Yeah, thank you. Arlington has always had that little bell at the 20 to 34 age group. We do see them come in and out. They're very mobile group, but there's a lot of them that come. We don't necessarily see that bubble age up the age pyramid. This is the age pyramid,
right?
The age pyramid going up. But I think that 65 plus age group is what we need to keep an eye on, and that is a very large age. They in Arlington. We'll see that group.
Right.
Yeah, really.
Do you make adjustments for units that are built, they're occupiable, but they in fact don't have people residing in them year round or whatever? It seems like there's a fair number of housing units that are not actually occupied year round by someone. How do you handle that? Do you see secular changes over time in that?
Yes, so we look at vacancy rates for single family and then also for multifamily housing. And right after the pandemic, there were vacancy rates so that factored in. Now we're back down to that 5% for multifamily.
And that seems to be fairly steady.
It does, you know, unless we have a pandemic or something, something like that, or unless, you know, happens. Just, and there's a lot of housing units that sometimes for a little bit. But then
I've got a question about outmigration. I know that this might not have been broken down at the level that I'm asking about in the presentation, but so when, you know, households are leaving Arlington, do you know where they're going? Like how often they're staying in Virginia, and then when they're staying in Virginia, where they're going within Virginia?
Yes, that data used to be, or it was available by the Census Bureau in a more timely fashion. But we can't, I don't know if that is, wasn't, yeah, they do have data from county to county migration flow, and I think the recent, that's not really, we could tell from previous decades, but.
Well, if you look on Twitter for "Don't Arlington My Richmond," that might give us a clue. That's a phrase. Don't Arlington My Richmond.
Just past years, it's been Texas, outside of Virginia, moving to Texas and Florida and California.
And in Virginia, like how often is it Richmond versus like Fairfax or Loudoun? Or is there a way to say?
Yes, we can look at that. Let's look at that. I'm not sure we have the latest data, but we can.
And just I'm not hunting the ball.
Yeah.
I think you've actually provided something on this before.
Might
I
have.
just didn't see it in the presentation. So I just didn't want you doing any work over again.
We will find that.
A question for you. I'm just trying to understand the predicted decline over the next few years when you take out the last 3 years for the pandemic, we were on a positive projection. The next 5 years, it goes down for our schools. Is that using the 3 years of pandemic data, or is that other trends that are just kind of exacerbated by what happened during the pandemic, or are we kind of waiting to see, but keeping that downward trend just in case?
The projections use September 30th snapshot. So every September 30th, the things that happen is that the number of cohorts actually went down. So the base, so there's a starting point, and that's done by every school. And so for many of the schools, for example, like middle school, that base is lower. So that would impact the projections. For elementary, it's really, new housing is a factor, but the student generation rates, if you compare the current ones compared to maybe 5 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, they're going to be slightly lower. So every unit produces or generates less students. That's another factor, especially at elementary, that the assumptions that are made for the incoming kindergarten students really start impacting elementary projections. And then they also impact the long-term projections. If you think about it, the number of births have been going down, actually, like the actual numbers, not just the forecasted. And 5 years later, there's an implication for the incoming kindergarten students. But then the capture rate has been going down. And so the impact is twofold. And in the projections, for fall 2023, there's one incoming K cohort that is impacted by those impacts that are, fairly new to APS. By the second year of the projection, it's 2 cohorts. So that just keeps getting multiplied over time. So those incoming cohorts, starting in the first projection year, they will have a life in APS in the model.
12 years, right? Yeah.
And so that, I think, is more than anything what is explaining some of the changes, as well as some of the larger cohorts graduating, moving to college, moving out of the APS system. So,
Do I remember correctly that it was probably the fall of 2019, the year before 2019, so in 2018, we saw like in the out years, we were looking at like more than 2,000 over enrollment for elementary schools, like 2,600 for elementary school. And then the very next year, that dropped by like more than 1,000.
Yes.
And that was, so even before the pandemic, we were already starting to see the impact of the lower rates and lower capture rates.
And that was a result of work that Elizabeth and I did together. We were realizing that the model developed by RLS needed some further calibration, over projecting. And again, in the inverse of what I said about lower birth, lower cohort transition rates, the births are high. You could have incoming K cohorts that might be larger than some of your existing K cohorts. If in that case, it's the opposite. So that impact going through the 10 years of projection year, starting with that first cohort, they're going to ripple through the whole, for every grade. So
We did see the reality of that from starting in 2010, where the actual kindergarten cohorts were larger, every year coming in.
And that's one of the things to be mindful about projections is that projections, you're relying on past trends, but sometimes with the pandemic, most recently, the trends are shifting very rapidly. And so that, what you're relying on to look forward is not necessarily reliable at that point in time because things are shifting so quickly. And that's where at the beginning of the presentation, I said, we're waiting for the next September enrollment number, the following September enrollment numbers to see, since the pandemic, we have one year's worth of data, fall 22. But we need to understand what is the new normal. We need more data points.
Oh, one last question. Do you see any change in like people moving in or out that could change, or is it really captured by the housing types? This is a highly transient workforce with the federal government, and various agency stuff.
And I'm glad Elizabeth is here because one of the ways that the enrollment projections factor in and out migration is through the birth forecast. I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that.
Sorry, could you repeat your
Sure.
question?
Well, I mean, I'll use myself as an example. We moved here in 2015 with 3 school-age children, 2 school-age children, 1 pre-K, 1 old enough. We weren't on any in the 2013 or 2014. I wasn't on anybody's radar. Right? Our family came in, and then we moved away, and then we came back. So we, it's very small. My family's not huge, but is that something you can track? People coming and going into Arlington. Does that change, or is that a factor that matters that much, or is it kind of evens out in the wash?
Yeah, that's that migration element within our forecast that we use in looking at average household size. So if there were, 300 more families like yours coming in and they were replacing,
that would be part of a larger trend.
Right, be part of the larger trend.
Okay, thank you.
So we might not see the little blips here and there. We do capture it at different geographies. I do want to follow up with your question, and I found online there is a census mapper. Census has a lot of things online. Some are better than others. Colors don't look that great, but okay. So this is the latest ACS. No, this is the 1 year behind. This is the 2016-2020 American Community Survey. It shows county to county migration. I guess it's the census flows mapper is their fancy title for it. I put in Arlington County, and this shows you where net migration for Arlington County. So the blue looks at negative migration. So they're losing migration to Fairfax. So that's the deepest color. We can zoom out to the whole country. That shows you where Arlington, someone to Alaska. And Hawaii, that's probably a better one. That's online, hopefully. Latest ACS is 2020.
A lot of retirement destinations there too.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question, and you may have answered it when you commented to Stacy, but you have the projections up through 2032, and that's tied into some of those changes we talked about of 65 and up have doubled, 20 to 34 decrease. Is that also built out through your projections through 2050? I mean, I think you answered this, but I just didn't catch it. With the idea that, let's say in 2032, the percentage of the over 65 here is 12%. Does that mean that in 2050, you're thinking, yep, it's going to be 35% of them are all 60? Like, does it just continue, or are you agnostic about that?
That's a great question. So you're asking, are we looking at age when we do projection, and if it's in that aging population, are we counting?
Do we need to start thinking about turning schools back into community centers 30 years from now? That's what I'm asking, essentially.
So when we do our forecast, it's mostly based on land use and housing factors, and like I mentioned, not necessarily looking at age directly, but it's built into the underlying.
So you could take what your housing trend has put for 2050, and then you could presumably build out a school population based on that.
Yes, based on what we know now.
Yeah, and it is probably not worth the paper it's printed on just because it's so far out. But at the same time, you are kind of introducing the idea of where we are in 2050. And maybe we don't ask for it in 2050. Maybe we ask for what that looks like in 30 or no, 2040. Sorry.
You're making a really important point, which is that in 20 years, if this continues, our school population is like essentially flat, maybe like a little bit higher. The population of single households or small households without kids is way higher. It's concentrated along those growth corridors. So in 20 years, we're not going to be talking about schools. We're going to be talking about all these other things that we need to support that population. To your point.
Pickleball.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that.
we're going to need it on those corridors under the current zoning policies. Important to consider, and wanted to ask as well, like all this, the letter we're going to talk about later, everything going on, is that a factor in this growth and whatnot? Like if we start allowing different housing types, we've talked about that being a big factor for most of these reports. If we start allowing more of the mixed use or what, I don't know. It's not obviously elevator garden rate, market rate, but whatever they're going to add to the change in zoning, like what's your all's input to that?
Right. So similar like what was done with accessory dwelling units.
Yeah.
Well, we monitor that, see what data we have every year, and we incorporate it into our forecast. Robert, this is the first year, right, that you put it into your student generation
So now
rates?
that's in the master housing unit database from the county. Now there's a student generation rate for that small number of units that have actually been built.
What is it?
Can't recall.
Well, I mean, I
It's-
think you had 0.47 was
Yeah,
single
but the
family.
rate, but in that student generation rates, it's included there at its own. So it's single family detached with, so it's not for the accessory dwelling unit
course.
itself, it's
So
for
it's a
the,
different.
the parcel, single-family home with a ADU.
But then, so that like leads me to believe that if you have planning factors for what's already being proposed, I mean, they exist, townhomes exist, two unit townhomes, like what are those planning factors? How
Well,
would that change?
So, for missing middle, which is what we're asking about, the county did ask KPS for estimates on, based on the consultant's report, on average, how many generated. I can't remember the number exactly.
It was low.
Yeah, in terms of students, K to 12, from what the consultant said would be built net in terms of units. So
That's 9 students per 20 units. So that's actually similar to a single family housing.
No, it
Great.
was not
Developments.
for about, it was over 100 units.
Oh, okay, so it's 9 students per 100 individual
Right,
residents.
Robert
Okay,
used
so that's
this-
much
Robert
lower.
used the
I
same
think we're
student
trying to
generation.
compare
factors
apples
that
to
you
apples.
But the caveat is, some of these new housing types, not in that type of housing type is not a big difference in the county. So it's using proxies. So for example, single family detached or townhomes or duplex factors that are in the generation rates. Some of the existing factors as proxies for some of these proposed housing types. With the understanding that, just like with accessory dwelling units, Elizabeth will be monitoring it in the master housing unit database. Once they're there and they're confirmed that they're built, then, using GIS, we can look at, okay, what students reside at those parcels and start building those rates by attendance zone.
Kind of to recap then, because I think some people in the public comment might be interested. If you get the student generation rate off, it could have a big influence, maybe more so than if you get the number of missing middle housing units built each year off. Like if you get the student, because it sounds like from what I heard, if it's 9 students per 100, you've got a student generation rate of 0.09. That's much lower than single family housing, which was 0.47. So you can get that pretty wrong, and still we're not going to end up with a huge. Oh, sorry.
We would have.
We would, yeah. If you get that wrong, we could end up with a lot more versus if it's double the housing and it's 200 units instead of 100, that's not going to impact the student generation if you got it right. I don't know. Maybe that's not useful for others, but I think it's helpful for
But
me
you
to
update
understand.
the student generation factor every year based on actual
Yeah,
data.
and again,
Yeah,
the
But we're talking
proxies-
about like the launching off the cliff into the great unknown right now.
Yeah.
Just like what.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of concern about, not just for schools, but for all facilities, as our charter
Yeah.
is for, what are all these extra units going to, getting ahead of myself. Right. Answer, but, it's schools, it's parks, it's parking, it's all the things that, make Arlington a great place to live and raise a family or grow old in if you're over 65 or whatever, your situation is, I think. Interesting that the way the population changes is tied to housing types, and we've got this big question mark as a community to try and think about.
I mean, for me, kind of looking at that, the growth of Arlington into 2050, it sort of underscores kind of the research that we did in our report, where a lot of the jurisdictions that adopted missing middle that we studied did it as part of this long-range visioning process for the county, and how it's sort of a visioning of how we want our county to look like in the future. And it communicates to the public that there is thinking about how we are going to accommodate 74,600 more people in Arlington, which is land constrained. We're not making any more land. I mean, that's something that we have to think about. I mean, when you think about that, you also have to think, well, yeah, we need new housing. So yes, we need planning for that, but I think we also have to understand how that impacts all our other infrastructure, our parks, our schools, our community centers, our fire stations. Is there, what kind of Arlington do we want to envision in 20 years? And is that tied to energy sustainability goals? Is that tied to, also transportation? Are we, putting in more bike lanes? Are we putting in more, electric car charging station? Kind of what is that visioning? And I think, for me, that kind of tries to sort of look at things from a very broad perspective. Sort of seeing that number, that 75,000 number, really underscores, I think, my personal desire to want to embark, to really encourage the county to do that long-range planning about how we're going to accommodate that 70. And I'm not saying that it isn't being done. I mean, you guys are obviously doing this work where you're coming up with these numbers and you're looking at things. But I think, at the very least, I would get the county to communicate this plan and to consolidate it so that it is, so the public understands that it's being done. And, the water, the sewage, there's, every part of the comprehensive plan be impacted by 75,000 more, or more, not more students, people. And then you can imagine that at least some of those are going to be more students, 10,000 more, whatever the number is you want to project. That's, when I was on the FAC, that's, we sort of, what would our school system look like if we had 35,000 students? I think it was 25,000, and if we looked at 30,000 and 35,000 and 40,000, how many more schools would we need? How many more, and how do you fit that in a 26 square mile county?
I think what's great about the presentation is, thanks so much for doing this. It's just really informative. So I'm sitting all the time on the planning commission. I've never had a presentation like this, so it's very, very useful. I like to think of, we need to develop a healthy ecosystem of housing and community services, and not a boom and bust where we have apparently lots of really old people who are, hanging around. And, but we, like Claire just said, we run the risk of not having enough students per. We need a healthy ecosystem of housing that handles life cycles from young to old, with nobody losing out, hopefully. Affordability, and accomplishing the whole spectrum. I think what you're showing is that you can plan for that to some degree. We're the victim of our own success, the incredible housing prices, because it's such a desirable place. And the trick then is to how to leverage that success into something that achieve community goals. I think we've fallen a little short of the conversation about that far. I think, the one thing I was going to ask is if it's possible to correlate any of this data with housing prices, or if you try to do that, or student generation rates, how do they relate to any sort of housing price?
So there's, for multifamily, there's 3 categories of rates. Multifamily, high-rise elevator, market rate, mixed income, and committed affordable only. Same thing for garden multifamily. That's the only.
But not for single family.
No.
But almost
like over time.
Right.
If interest rates are high or low, how does that change how much house people buy in Arlington?
It also impacts our debt service limit. Rates rise, then thank you guys very, very much for
Thank you.
such a great presentation. I think it'd be interesting, as just throwing this out there, I would be interested in having kind of an annual update of the Arlington profile report, for this committee. I think that would be something that would be, I mean, if you
We're
were.
happy to do that. I go to the Transportation Commission, right? So Emily does now.
Yeah. Yeah, or, I mean, I think, it would be something that's also very much like actions report. And I will also add, I think the way that I have seen Arlington County and APS work continue to grow in their working together. So I just want to say thank you for doing such great work in that. And, I feel like it's, you guys are continually striving to improve, even though I feel like what you're doing is already, very strong, as strong as a projection can be. But I do appreciate the fact that we have worked together and that okay, so our next agenda item is approval of the final report on public-private partnerships. We did discuss this at the last meeting, but we could not vote to approve it. I imagine that there may still be some, kind of, typo changes that Kathleen wanted to make, some little word pieces.
I think I had a few tweaks.
Right.
To one portion.
So are you all comfortable in voting to approve it with those minor changes? Want to move to?
I move to approve the final report on new and substantially the.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, great. PPC report passes unanimously.
Got 9 minutes back.
Okay, the recommendations on updates to the charter. I made a few, I made a couple of changes based on the feedback from the other meeting, which was basically to take out the, there was a paragraph in there about the AFSAP and about, kind of defining what, and I think APS is going to change about the AFSAP.
I believe so. I do not know the name.
Yeah, I don't know the new name either, but I think that they're going to change. So I think just taking out, and then there was a very nebulous thing about what the county did for its needs assessment, something that we've never heard of before, but it was in our charter. So I basically took that out. I'm not, but other than that, I think what I sent out was based on, and even that taking that paragraph out was based on the feedback. So can we, Matt, can you put up?
Yes.
you want to make? So the main changes, as we talked about at the last meeting, are just to talk about collaborative long-range facility planning and to make that, sort of move that up to number one of our charge. And then, continue to review the capital improvement plan. The number 3 is the one where I took out some of the original charter language. And I think I may just want to add in there, review the APS and county needs assessment reports, comma, facility capacity and utilization plans, and other reports that inform CIP direction. Because basically that's what the ASAP does, is inform CIP direction, and we can probably find other things in the county that also inform CIP direction. Because I think that's really, kind of foundational. This is the foundational planning to CIPs that happens in those off years. So instead of just naming specific reports, we're just sort of saying, we're calling them reports that inform CIP direction.
Creating a catch-all.
What they
Yeah.
do, yeah. Stacy, I did notice that something got cut out, it looks like for item 1, it just says decision-making tools.
Okay, I think
there
that
at
was
the
a
end.
note that I put on there, and we can we'll work with that. Then so 3 will review the APS county needs assessment reports, comma, facility capacity and utilization plans, and
Not to invite wordsmithing, but if you want me to share the word version with you.
sure. Yeah.
I'm not inviting wordsmithing.
Plans, reports. Yes, please. Okay, so number 3, review the APS and county needs assessment reports, comma, facility capacity and utilization plans, and other reports and data that inform CIP direction. And receive and review public. Okay, yeah, I think everyone comfortable with that? Then I think everything else is pretty standard. We changed the number of members from 23 to 15. I think 25 to 15. And then we took out some of the other liaison committees that were not. But basically everything is, we just kind of consolidated a lot of language to support collaborative long-range planning between the county. And then changes. Any suggestions, requests? Have a motion to approve?
We approve.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, all right. Updates to our charter passed unanimously. Okay.
And don't worry, Diana, we're watching for you, so.
Okay, so now our final letter to the county board on the missing middle housing report study that we did. I wanted to send this letter just to reiterate the recommendations that we made in this report, given that the county is about to vote on a very big change in our county, and I thought these recommendations were important.
Is it possible to pull them up? I just don't remember. And if the idea is basically resending the same thing without modifying it.
Right.
We may want to try to understand why we're doing that.
Right.
As in, what message are we trying to send by resending the same?
Didn't answer the first time.
Right. I mean, I tried to articulate that, but if you have suggestions on how we can articulate that more clearly. So the 3 recommendations that we made in the report, I think the first one is especially important. Consider using information learned from the missing middle housing study to inform and also to be informed by an expanded long-range vision of the future of Arlington as a whole, including considerations for transportation, diversity, equity, parks, environmental conservation, sustainability, and schools and public. So basically what we recommended was Arlington, we noticed in these
Almost every single.
in these other jurisdictions that we studied that they were adopted missing middle as part of a 20 to 30 year visioning of their county. And we made the recommendation for Arlington to do that.
We sent this letter before the actual zoning text was released.
Right, the report was April 2022. We also recommended
Maybe I can pause there. If we resend our prior recommendation, but we are sending it right now, basically in conjunction with a vote, is this ambiguous, or are we saying don't adopt anything right now because you don't have a long-term plan? Like, what are we saying here?
I agree.
if you go ahead and
If I didn't want to say.
go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying. I think the letter we sent was perfect for the time, but now we're looking at a vote potentially, one way or the other, that does not include anything that we recommended as far as a long-term vision. And I think it's important that, if we are doing the research and that took the time that many people have put many hours in looking at all these different jurisdictions and came up with this recommendation to say, hey, we need sure, not saying either way whether you should or shouldn't, but it should be part of a larger plan, and it's not, then I think we should make that a very salient point to the county, as we have very little time for it to be relevant.
Which is not what I was suggesting. I was just
Oh,
asking, is that what we're doing?
Right. I mean,
I'm
I
just trying
think
to understand what are we doing?
we were very careful when we wrote the report to not say, the language that we used is use the information learned from the missing middle housing study to inform and also be informed by a long-range vision. It doesn't say stop what you're doing and do this long-range vision. I think where we are in the county, I think we would, in my mind, making this recommendation if we made this recommendation and it was heard by a majority of county board members and a long-range visioning process was initiated as part of adopting missing middle, I would personally think that would be a very good move by Arlington County. I don't want, it is not my intention. I don't think it's a reasonable, personally, I don't think it's a reasonable ask to say, stop what you're, right, they're not gonna do it. Stop what you're doing and do the long-range vision. I think sort of.
I speak a little
Yeah.
out of school. At least the conversations I've had, and I really don't like to. My understanding, or let's say it's my mischaracterizing, is that there is a longing for strategic. With this first passage of missing middle, to then say refine it. And so I personally think the letter could have a lot of value because it would strengthen that view that my understanding is held by at least 2, if not 3 boards. And that, and I'm taking way out of school because I don't, like to sort of, characterize other
Two out of the 3 board members who will still be there.
Yeah.
After this term.
Correct.
So it would be reinforcement for line of thinking that is already, yeah.
Because I think it's critical to future. Some of the notion that has been stated is that the missing middle ends exclusionary zoning. It sort of breaks the system. But these are my words. Once you break it, you have to fix it. And I think that the letter would reinforce the notion of attempting to fix broken first so that we can.
What
And
I'm
those are my
hearing
words.
though, is that it might serve us to be a little bit less ambiguous and say, we are reminding you of this recommendation that we sent before because we are agnostic about, I think this is the sentiment here. We are agnostic about whether you vote or how you vote. Like we haven't had that discussion yet on yay or nay for missing middle. But if you proceed, we recommend you promptly follow up with an accompanying long-term planning. And if you don't, we still recommend that you promptly follow up with a long, but just to make it clear that we're not saying anything that could be interpreted as
We're
a
not taking
thumbs
a
up, thumbs
position.
down,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
That's maybe what I'm thinking.
Yeah. I mean, that's my hope for it too. I don't know if it came across that way. If there's a way that we can, change a few sentences or add some things in there, I'm absolutely open to doing that. I do think we should probably.
And and this is maybe too aggressive, but one thing you could say is just, as members have watched the discussion unfold in the community once the text was released, it's a letter that we sent previously is again clear to us the importance of looking at this planning exercise. That I don't know how exactly you say there wasn't a fulsome discussion or there wasn't enough time or you might not say that, but you might find a way to find that in some ways.
Right. I mean, we do say, that is charged with examining long-range schools, public facilities, and land use planning to reiterate the recommendation we made in the report that we issued to you and the school board in April of 2020. In the report, we presented the results of research on 6 jurisdictions that have pursued, and then we Should we add a sentence in here that says, in this report, we, as a commission, we found it notable that majority of the jurisdictions that adopted missing middle did, did it along with a long-range planning process.
But that still creates the same ambiguity.
Yes.
Yeah.
It
we
seems
could
like
add
we
your
need to say, we are not taking a position, yay or nay, about whether you proceed at this moment, but we support long-range planning, frankly, with a missing middle component or without one. It sounds like that's really,
There should be more planning, whether you decide, whatever you decide to
Yeah.
do, not our concern. However, if you go down this path, you need to consider the effects of the joint facility.
So what if at the end of the first paragraph, after the parenthetical, we say something along the lines of, we take no position on whether the county board should adopt the proposal. We do reiterate a recommendation that recognizes, and I'm not sure you can phrase it however you want to,
Yeah.
the value of long-range planning regardless of the decision you make.
something like that, or in conjunction.
Would we be willing to even say the essentiality of long-range planning rather
Yeah.
than just value?
Yeah.
To make it a little stronger?
Absolutely, yeah.
When you change housing types, it is essential to change to consider the effect of long-range planning.
So to the point,
We want them to, sorry.
no, go ahead.
We want them to consider, like, hey, you've got all these other, there's a lot of loud noises. But what we want them to realize is that whatever you decide, make sure you have a long-range plan, either way. Because we don't have one. We saw that in these jurisdictions that it should definitely be.
So I'm not sure whether we address this specifically, but there's a nuance here that our report captures. That is that there are two very different kinds of planning that we're talking about here. One is more of the long-range visioning that I think Montgomery County and some others did when they said, all right, we're considering missing middle, but as part of, a sort of look at our general land use plan or their equivalent, saying, what do we want our neighborhoods to look like? And I think that's one of the conversations that we really haven't had. It's been very focused on, particular impacts and popularity in certain neighborhoods without really a larger conversation about, all right, well, if planning estimates project that the bulk of the growth over the next, several decades is going to be along these planning corridors, like, is that what we want? To what extent should we be accommodating more growth in our residential neighborhoods? What would that look like? That's not really a conversation that I think we have had at a county level. And I think that sort of long-range visioning of what should our neighborhoods look like, the conversation we're having. But there's also a separate piece, which is more kind of nuts and bolts planning in the sense of, all right, so now that we have a policy in mind, or maybe even the policy we've already passed, we expect it to bring about change. How do we measure those changes, and how do we anticipate and address them so that those changes don't become problems? So how do we address potential impacts on school development? How do we kind of assess the kind of viability of our stormwater systems and understand if we get more development in certain pockets, could that add more stress? How do we plan for all of that? And so that's, I think, another piece that's is worth mentioning. But one of the striking things about the research that we did was that I'm not going to use any millennial memes, but for anyone who's familiar with Leroy Jenkins, so I guess I'm going to do it. So a lot of jurisdictions that went ahead and upzone for missing middle did so without addressing public facilities impacts, which I found surprising. And I think that the at least consensus among the planners there was that, well, this is going to be very gradual, it's going to be diffuse, and we have time for it. And so I'm not sure whether we want to acknowledge that.
But they need more land.
None of them were in areas that were close to an urban center like we are, not the 16 square miles. That changes things. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right.
I
I think.
But so I think
Just
just
to
talking about
Wells's point, I
not
think,
visioning, planning.
right, I
That's true,
think,
yeah, that's a distinction.
I think that we all, which is why we included, so when I first thought of writing the letter, I was just going to include the first recommendation, which was to do the long range, the broad long range planning. But we had two other recommendations, and one of them was to continue to work to fully incorporate schools and public facilities into long-range planning processes. So it's really more of our, sort of the smaller bits that that is in our lane.
Yeah.
And how that impacts the changes to housing policies and zoning will impact, schools and public. So that's our second one. And the third one is to maintain the close collaboration between the county and APS by sharing information on projected student enrollment, kind of those sort of little nuts and bolts things that.
Keep up the good work.
It supports the first point.
Right.
essentially.
So, just in the, Matt, we are at like 9:15, and I apologize for that, everyone. So I'm adding a sentence here that says, we are not taking the position, this is, as you decide whether to approve the advertised expanding housing options proposal, we write on behalf of JFAC, to reiterate the recommendations we made in the report. And then I'm adding a sentence, we are not taking a position on whether or not we decide to adopt expanded housing options. However, we feel strongly that broad and long-range planning for impacts to the changes be implemented.
With urgency.
What?
With urgency, I would say that you might.
Immediately be included.
Be implemented, be included.
Implemented.
Is
Undertaken.
an essential implementation?
Yeah.
It should be whether we are not taking a position on whether we should.
Okay, whether you could or adopt expanding housing options. However, we feel strongly that broad and long-range planning for impacts for the changes is essential.
I do like Wells's vision. Tuba.
Well, that's essentially the first point. So what if we work in both? We do feel strongly that the county should pursue long-range visioning as well as planning for any expected impacts.
I would say we're biting off. Like, let's just get one and let's just get the.
Yeah.
Let's ask
Okay.
for the most essential.
Yeah.
And then I was going to add at the end of the second full paragraph that says one of the notable aspects of our research was the finding that the majority of the research jurisdictions, adopted missing middle policies as part of a long-range planning process.
I might tweak it to say visioning because
Okay.
that's the nuance I'm trying to get at.
Okay. And then we list the 3 recommendations and said, we hope you will keep these recommendations in mind as you consider the expanding housing options proposal, planning broadly for the addition of new homes and new housing types in residential neighborhoods. Can help the county anticipate and address any impacts of redevelopment while also inspiring confidence among potentially affected residents. Anybody have any suggestions on how to strengthen that final sentence? Planning broadly for the future of Arlington as we adopt these major, as you just keep this sentence. Are you okay with that? All right, so with the addition of a sentence at the end that says we're not taking a position on whether or not you should or should not adopt expanding, saying that the impacts for the changes is an essential implementation. And then one that says one of the notable aspects of our research was the finding that the different jurisdictions had adopted. They did it as part of the long-range planning process. And then the 3 recommendations, and then the final sentence.
Don't lose the vision.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
why Wells was-
Okay, visioning.
No, I'm saying we don't want to ask for both. We haven't had that.
Oh, yeah,
But-
so-
But I think Wells' point was that they were visioning.
What, yeah, it was descriptive as to the other jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Oh,
We ask,
okay.
I'm comfortable. keeping
Yeah,
that.
okay.
I heard that missing.
Visioning or.
Yeah,
or-
I mean,
Got it.
we just
Yeah.
don't want
Yeah,
to
we're
lose
good. We're
the
good.
reference to vision.
It's hard to plan without
Okay.
We used to do it all the time.
Yeah, I feel like
Okay,
those people.
Diana, you have a,
Wait,
Muted.
are we
You're muted.
switching?
We can't.
Okay.
Your mute is off, but we still.
okay, we can't hear you still.
Can you type in the chat?
That, all right, well, do we have a motion to approve this letter? with-
Well, I'm wondering, do we need to find out what she's saying?
Yeah.
There's little blinking dots.
Press enter and then continue your thought. She can hear.
Might want to include a statement of interest in participating in the long-range planning.
I think that's our charter.
Yeah.
We look forward to working with you.
That's pretty much.
There's more blinking dots. Nice way to conclude his offer of assistance.
Maybe we could add a sentence after the fact. We don't
At the
have to
bottom.
wordsmith it right now. but-
Okay,
All right, I move to approve the letter substantially in the form that Stacy has modified it
Second.
and send it to the county board. You want to take the vote?
all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Right.
Did you copy the
passes.
planning commission? Copy the planning commission.
Or I can send it to you and I will send it to the commissioners and then you can send it to the planning commission?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know that I can.
We
Yeah,
can-
or you can send me the planning commission.
We can transmit it through the planning commission,
Okay,
if that's what you want.
okay,
You don't advise the public.
okay. Do you have public comment? Are you?
Can I say something? My name's Maureen. I am a candidate for Arlington County Board, who fundamentally believes that this committee is doing the Lord's work. I know some of y'all from other things that I've been involved in, but I just wanted to come by, especially with the projections presentation, and just listen and be here. I'm happy to talk with anyone afterwards, but really just hear and make sure I'm informed.
All right, well, do you want to check to make sure? I don't know if anyone joined us remotely or not for public comment.
I don't think we have
Any others?
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, well, I'm sorry I kept everyone over time, but thank you so much for coming in person and being here. It's really important that we passed all 3 of these.
Thank you.
Yay! And so now we'll start afresh in March at a virtual meeting to hear the long-range plan to renovate existing facilities. Which I think will be really
Stacy, I know I'm not going to be able to join, but that's why I asked about recording.
It will be recorded, yeah.
All right.
I just want to tell folks, Maureen, for being here, Embrace Science Arts is hosting a Democratic candidate debate on April 17th on the run. It will be about the arts, but facilities will be coming out.
All right,
Will be
well,
coming
thank
out.
you.
Yep.
April 17th.